Welcome to the Radical Centrist Podcast, where we explore a politics that steps outside of the realm of the poisonous partisanship that has infected our country in recent years. And we seek ways to place the American voice, the American idea, above tribalism, partisan politics, and blind allegiance to ideology. To challenge ourselves to ask questions and seek answers that can bridge the divides between people, parties, and ideologies. Radical centrism is not quiet and meek, but outspoken and unapologetic. Radical centrism celebrates raucous debate, tempered with civility and humility. Fair warning. Be careful when you listen to these podcasts. You may find yourself opening your mind to the possibilities that suddenly come available to us when we listen to one another. This is your host, Wayne King, and my ultimate goal is to create aha moments where the conservative blue-collar worker or the businesswoman down the road and the liberal academic from the local college find themselves saying, that's an interesting idea. If I can just once in a while set off that light bulb, then I have the chance to convince you that there is real value in talking to one another, and more important, in listening to one another. If we listen, really listen to one another, we can find a way to express our American voice, the one that celebrates our common ideals and respects our differences. If we can find our American voice, then maybe, just maybe, we can sing together too. What a joyous sound that would be. So let's get started.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch!
Let's jump right into this. I am honored to have our old friend of the podcast on, Kreis, and his daughter, Rose Keller, join us to talk about what I'm calling the 65 Roses campaign. I don't know what they're calling it. We'll find that out in a moment. But and to discuss the entire scope of the thing, plus talk about the importance of understanding cystic fibrosis and its impact both on Rose and on Dawn. So if you don't mind, Rose, I think I would like to start by asking Dawn to say a little bit about sort of the arc of his experience that brought him to this place with all of us.
Sounds good. Well, let me just start, Wayne, by saying it's a great pleasure to be on this podcast yet again. And it's even more exciting to be sort of the co-star of an episode with my daughter, Rose. And to answer your question, she is the reason. I knew almost nothing about cystic fibrosis until about 5 months into the life of my daughter, Rose. Rose was a failure to thrive baby. And failure to thrive just means that your baby isn't getting bigger and healthier, and they don't really know why that is. So after a lot of dithering around and worrying and fretting, somebody finally thought, well, what if we test this kid for cystic fibrosis? It's a very simple test for what is the second most common inherited genetic disease really in the world, second to sickle cell disease. And so they did this little sweat test, and all of a sudden, I had a daughter with cystic fibrosis, and I had to educate myself about CF. And Rose was a baby, so she didn't have to educate herself, but I and Rose's mother did. And I think I went into the fetal position for about a day, and after I did that, I kind of emerged and decided that I needed to lean into cystic fibrosis. It's funny, I'm very, very active in the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is the most badass healthcare charity on the planet, bar none. And people in the foundation are always thanking me and other people like me for quote unquote volunteering. But honestly, I'm not a volunteer. I mean, this thing like snuck up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder in 2002 and said, turn around and follow. I'm not volunteering. The people who work at the foundation, they're volunteering because they could be doing almost anything.
Well, so I was about to ask you what year this all began, but you said 2002.
Right. That Rose was born in November of 2001, and she was diagnosed in 2002. And here she is today, a healthy, happy, thriving, soon-to-be senior at Bowdoin College over in Maine.
Well, that's exciting. Soon to be senior.
Yeah, I only have a few weeks.
So, Rose, talk about growing up with cystic fibrosis and your dad's, and I assume your mom's impact on that process.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there was no tapping in my story. I've just always sort of had it. And my parents were both very devoted to making sure that I stayed as healthy as possible for as long as possible. So I never knew anything else except doing 2 hours of treatments a day, every day for the first 12 years of my life, at least. And, I'd have friends come over after school and they would sit and play Wii with me or watch TV with me as I did my vest and inhaled my nebulized medication. And that was just sort of my normal. And that included going to the hospital on a basically yearly basis. And I would have my teachers sometimes would come in and I'd have friends come in, and that was just kind of the status quo. And so I never really knew anything else. And I owe a lot of my current health to how adherent and supportive my parents were back when I was a lot younger, because being a college student is much more busy than being a young person. So,
Yeah.
Well, Rose, as one of those supportive parents, I have to sort of seize the reins here and say, you mentioned the vest. What the heck is that?
Yeah. So the vest is, I describe it as a vacuum cleaner to a lot of my friends. It's a physical therapy machine that I spend an hour attached to every day, that inflates and deflates. It's literally a vest that dislodges the mucus in my lungs. And sometimes, at least once a day, I do it attached to a nebulizer that applies medication directly to my lungs while that's going on. And so it's rather time consuming and invasive, but it's all I've ever known. And it is what keeps me out of the hospital. So, and everybody in my life has been very supportive of me getting that done as extensively and adherently as possible.
Yeah. Well, I have just a little bit of experience on that side, because my late wife, who was the love of my life, was required to use a nebulizer pretty much for the last 10 years of her life. And that was just, I can't even imagine how difficult it is to do that every single day of your life, including when you were a little kid.
I found it a lot easier when I was living it, to be honest. In the real world, it gets pretty busy. And so I'd be lying if I said I was perfect about it or anywhere close to perfect, to be honest. But it is something that I wake up and try to do better on every day. And it's a lot of sterilization and a lot of boiling water and a lot of making sure that then, little plastic pieces are all in the right places. And yeah.
I have to brag that I actually got to meet the physician who invented the vest, a pulmonologist named Warren Warwick, who, alas, is not among us anymore. But for me, it was like meeting Elvis. I was just so thrilled. I have so many heroes in the world of cystic fibrosis, and Dr. Warwick was one of them. There, Atul Gawande, the healthcare writer and surgeon who writes in the New Yorker, he actually wrote an article about Dr. Warwick that appeared in the New Yorker in 2004 called The Bell Curve. It's really cool.
Don, talk about the genetic aspects of cystic fibrosis, because as I understand it, both the husband and wife or the have to bring a genetic predisposition to the table in order for this to sort of become full-blown cystic fibrosis. Is that
That is correct. And let me just break the news to you, Wayne, that they actually don't have to be husband and wife. They just have to they just have to be parents. Right. You can go right back to your high school genetics and the sort of brown-eyed, blue-eyed thing. And you can create the Punnett square. And it works exactly the same way with cystic fibrosis. The CF gene is on chromosome 7. I am a CF heterozygote, which means on one of my chromosome 7 pair, there's a CF mutation, and on the other one, there isn't. And that was also true of Rose's mother. And when we mated, we had a 1 in 4 chance of producing a baby with cystic fibrosis. And we had a 2 in 4 chance of producing a baby who was a heterozygote like we are. And we had a 1 in 4 chance of producing a baby with no CF mutations. And with Rose, we hit the jackpot.
So I'm told that when you're walking down the street at any particular time, you probably meet lots of people who have the one genetic feature, but it's
that's right. I think it's about 1 in 26 people has a CF mutation, but they're heterozygous, most of them, meaning they don't have cystic fibrosis. They're just a carrier. And so it's very, very common. There are about 40,000 people in the United States who have cystic fibrosis now. And interestingly, the number of people with CF is going up, and that is actually a good thing. Why? Because people are living longer. If I had been born with CF, I just turned 65, I would be 60 years dead by now. I'm sure of it. When Rose was born, the median predicted survival age was 31 years. Today it's 56 years. And that is because of the amazing work that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation does. It is, as I said, a badass healthcare charity.
And as I recall, when before Zach was born, he was kind of our miracle baby. But we had, because Alice was Armenian and because I was had a good share of Native American blood in me, we had to be tested for all kinds of things. Did you go through that process back in 2002 or?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, Wayne. Rose was born in November of 2001, and the answer to your question is no. We had neither Rose's mom or I had any notion that we were CF carriers. We had no history of cystic fibrosis in our family that we knew of, so we didn't do any prenatal testing. And when they wanted to test Rose for CF, I said, well, why do they want to do that? Like, why should we do that? And they said, well, it's a really simple test. So I said, well, all right, go ahead and do it. I am often credited with being responsible, and I suppose I am partially responsible for making sure that no New Hampshire families ever have to go through what our family went through. No more failure to thrive cystic fibrosis babies. Why? Because now every baby born in the state of New Hampshire is tested at birth for cystic fibrosis as part of the state's newborn screening program. And that's true, I think, in at least 49, if not maybe 50 of the states. But at the time, it was a new cutting edge thing, and there was a bit of resistance. And I took Rose's pulmonologist with me down to the State House in Concord, and we were like a hot knife through butter.
So you became an early advocate on the legislative side of things.
Yes. Well, I was a state employee back then. I worked at the Public Utilities Commission. I knew how to talk to the legislature, and like going in front of the legislature as the dad of a kid with a disease. I mean, it was unfair how much leverage I had. But we had to do some real talking and persuading. And then we had to get the rules adopted. That was a whole nother process that was actually quite difficult. But as a result of that, I've had the experience. I was at a CF meeting once, and a woman walks up to me and she pulls out a wallet photo of her cute little baby. And she says, "I just want to thank you because I have a healthy baby thanks to you." And I love to tell that story because now I know for sure that I get to go through life knowing I've done something good, which feels good.
Well, and here's a quick civics lesson that you've opened the door for, and I'm only going to take a moment to talk about this, but most people don't really realize that when the legislature passes a bill and the governor signs it, that's really not the end of the process, is it?
No, it depends. If the bill tells a government agency to do something, a state agency, then almost always the state agency has to effectuate that by adopting a rule that says, here's how we are going to do that. And, we could spend the next 5 hours talking about how hard it is in New Hampshire to promulgate rules. Why is that? We don't like rules. So we have created a system that is deliberately vexatious as a state. That's the public policy of New Hampshire. But we ran that gauntlet.
But on the positive side, what it does is that it passes the onus for creating the final version of the legislation from legislators who in many cases have a lot of experience and understanding, but to people who on a daily basis are having to deal with these issues and who probably have the right educational credentials as well.
Well, the question of when to defer to the expertise of agencies, that's a good question for Rose, because that's her senior honors project at Bowdoin, although focused on federal law rather than state law. But I happen to have a daughter who's obsessed with that.
Rose, are you an
I wonder why.
on the deep state?
I guess you could call me something like that. I'm just gearing up for my honors project, so call me again in 6 months. But I am gearing up to become an expert in that, I guess is would be fair to say. I'm excited.
And how did you kind of choose that direction for yourself?
I would be lying through my teeth if I told you anything other than, I've always been a humanities-oriented person. I've taken all of Bowdoin's con law classes, but Dad deserves a lot of credit in that he and I spent a lot of time talking about general con law things when I was in constitutional law. And so one morning he sent me an email of I was considering, and I am considering, I'm studying for the LSAT, and I'm going to be taking next month. And I was, going through the motions of thinking about when and if to apply. And he basically
law school.
To law school, yes. Yep. And he sent me an email basically to the effect of, if you understand why this is cool, then I think you should go to law school, or that you should seriously consider going to law school. And so that was an email basically about this thing called the Chevron doctrine and deference to state agencies at the federal level, which I could talk about forever, but is not in any way CF related.
And well, it is CF related because everything is CF related ultimately. The cool thing, Wayne, is the U.S. It's not that cool, but the awesome thing, I guess, is that the U.S. Supreme Court has just accepted cert on a case in which the court will reconsider that precedent, the so-called Chevron doctrine, which is named after a case called Chevron. But we should get back to cystic fibrosis.
Yeah.
I want to brag about my fundraising campaign. I just turned 65 years old on July 24th. And I'm very active in the Northern New England chapter of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And a couple of meetings ago, one of my fellow members of the advisory board for the chapter said, hey, you know, I met this guy who has a 65 roses tattoo. Why a 65 roses tattoo? 65 roses is a fundraising meme of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. It has to do with a little kid who had CF, and his mother's like raising money on the phone for the foundation, and she's doing that, and she finally finishes, and the little kid goes, "I know what you're doing, mommy," and she says, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, you're raising money for 65 roses," because he didn't understand, like he heard she was saying cystic fibrosis, but he heard 65 roses.
Oh.
And so that becomes a sort of meme. So anyway, my fellow member of the chapter advisory board goes, I ran into somebody who had a 65 roses tattoo. And I scoffed. I just said, oh, come on. That's nothing. What would really be impressive is if somebody actually got 65 separate roses tattooed on their body somewhere. And then it just hit me in one of these blinding flashes of insight. Like I was just the guy to do it. Why? Because you know how, like, you run into all these young people, Rose's age, who get tattoos. And if you're me, I don't know if you think this, Wayne, but I think, like, how are they going to know 50 years from now that they're still going to like that crazy tattoo they just got now as an 18-year-old? And so then I thought, well, I'm already old, so I'll never get to that point if I get I don't have any tattoos now, but if I get some, like, I won't live long enough to regret it, I don't think. And so I just decided I was the guy to do it. So right there at the meeting, I said, all right, if I can raise $65,000 for the CF Foundation by the end of the year, I will have 65 roses tattooed on me. And so I went home, and who did I ask about this? I called up Rose. Rose, when I said I was going to raise $65,000 and get all those tattoos, what did you say?
I thought it was a noble idea, but that the price tag was way too low because you don't want it to be too achievable. If you're going to tattoo up your body, if you're going to sell away, you know, surface area on your person, you ought to make the price tag tall.
And so therefore, what price did you recommend?
$650,000 seems more appropriate to me, at least.
Wow.
Right. So I followed Rose's advice, and Rose even invented the official slogan of the campaign, which is,
make that geezer get those tattoos.
so yes, so we're all over social media with "Make those geezers get those tattoos," and we rolled this campaign out right about on my birthday on July 24th, and we've already raised about $8,500, I think.
Hey, that's great. So Rose, was Don kind of a helicopter parent when you were growing up? I mean, was he always hovering over you, or was he giving you a chance to fly free?
I can't wait to hear the answer to this question.
Well, I'm on air, so but no, Dad wasn't a helicopter parent. I mean, both of my parents are very academically and professionally inclined people. So I spent a lot of time in my youth, or at least to the best of my memory, doing whatever I felt like I wanted to do. And though I will say that when it comes to my treatments and when it came to my health, my dad and my mom were both very militant when it came to me in terms of making sure that I was as healthy as I possibly could be. But I think my parents were appropriately removed when the situation called for it. I feel like I had a relatively normal childhood, despite the fact that, you know, you can approach CF. I think it would be really easy as a person who is now an adult and can see how difficult it is to parent. It would be really easy to get all neurotic about it and to put your child into a bubble and to keep them home at every opportunity, or maybe even just homeschool. And I don't really think that that's an approach that would have benefited me. And so by and large, I think they all made the right calls, and I would not accuse anyone of being a helicopter parent, and at least not at this juncture. There's still time.
Don, you must have faced that demon when she was first born, and you thought about what was it going to be like to raise this child for us, and how are we going to let her have the freedom that she needs to develop into the kind of human being that I know you would want.
I remember being hyper aware of making a conscious choice when Rose was about 3 to do exactly the opposite of kind of putting my kid in a bubble. Like we put Rose into preschool, and then we sent her off to kindergarten, and she went to a great public elementary school in Vermont, and high school, and now college. And we decided that Rose was going to be a normal kid who was going to engage with the world. And I knew that by making that decision, I was probably making it inevitable that she was going to have to spend time in the hospital, because we can go into the root causes of CF. The lungs of people with CF are convenient hosts for opportunistic bacteria. And I just knew that by sending Rose out into the cruel, cold, really dirty world of other kids, she'd be inhaling all that opportunistic bacteria, and she'd end up in the hospital from time to time. But everybody all the time has to make these risk-benefit decisions. Like, do you walk out the door in the morning? Do you get behind the wheel of your car, even though you know that we kill 40,000 people a year on the nation's highways? I mean, we just have to make those risk-benefit calculations all the time. And so I thought about this a lot when the pandemic set in, and a lot of people just wanted everybody to be kind of in the bubble forever. No more people going to school, everybody kind of, just kind of wrapped in cellophane. And I thought, we're used to doing this in the CF world. Like, we make these choices all the time, and now everybody else is having to figure out how to do that. So yeah, it's been a big deal.
Well, I'd actually like to ask both of you to just give some advice to parents who do have a child with cystic fibrosis about how they should face that in their lives.
I think I should let Rose answer first.
Oh boy. Well, several things. I think making sure that you are, at the end of the day, as a parent, you are your child's best advocate. And I think frequently CF families will find themselves in tough positions where your care team is advocating for something, and you and your child might have other concerns that are also extremely valid, and the desire to live in the real world and touch grass and play on playgrounds and do well academically is often at odds with having the best pulmonary function test ever to be had ever. And so it's a tough balance, and just being a reasonable person about, and having reasonable expectations of how much time you're willing to really devote yourself to being in perfect health versus living a life is really important, and I get to figure it out. And I guess the only other thing I'd say is, be willing to have a lot of spend a lot of time sterilizing nebulizers. I have gotten really good at it, and I know how to do it in approximately 2.5 minutes.
Uh-huh.
I would say, as somebody who has now raised a kid with CF, you aren't lucky if you have cystic fibrosis. But if cystic fibrosis comes into your family the way it did my family, you should lean into it as a parent and know that you are part of a global network of people who are doing awesome things. I mentioned that Atul Gawanda story, and the 3 qualities that he associated with Dr. Warwick, the guy who invented the vest, are qualities that I associate with essentially everybody in the CF world that I meet. And those qualities are focus, aggressiveness, and inventiveness. So you don't have to be an MD or a PhD or even a JD to have focus, aggressiveness, or inventiveness. But that's how to conquer cystic fibrosis. And so, embrace the science, educate yourself about the disease, and be really, really hopeful, because we are making awesome progress. We are right on the brink of reducing cystic fibrosis to a curious medical footnote, which, when you think about it, is so remarkable because the disease itself was only first identified in 1938. Before 1938, cystic fibrosis was just a mysterious reason why some babies died. And then Dorothy Hanson Anderson, the chain smoking lesbian pathologist working in the basement of Columbia Presbyterian in New York, doing autopsies on babies who had died, started noticing this pattern that she called cystic fibrosis in pancreases. And she did all this research about whether anybody else was thinking about this. And she noticed that a few other docs had come up with this, made similar observations. And she had the brainstorm that resulted in identifying the disease. And I'd love to talk about Dr. Anderson because she was such a gifted person. She graduated from the St. Johnsbury Academy right near us, so up on the right on the Connecticut River in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. And she was a brilliant medical student. She wanted to be a surgeon, but they wouldn't let her because she was a woman, and it was the 1930s. And so she ended up being a pathologist, and she made one of the most remarkable scientific discoveries ever. Hundreds of thousands of people have led long and happy lives because of what she did. She is a hero. Sorry, I never met her. The irony being that she was a chain smoker and the tobacco companies killed her because she died of lung cancer.
So when she discovered this, what was it that what was the next step after that?
Well, the next step was figuring out, all right, well, what do we do? How do we treat this disease? And it first emerged that we had to figure out a way to replace digestive enzymes that weren't getting from the pancreas to the small intestines. And then we had to figure out how to jiggle people's lungs to shake out the sticky mucus. Cystic fibrosis is a cellular disease. And what it means is that chloride channels on the surface of your cells are not working properly. That doesn't matter anywhere in your body except in epithelial cells. And what are epithelial cells? Places where you have mucus. And so it's kind of a mucus disease. And slowly, science started to figure out how to make the mucus less sticky, and also how to diagnose the disease. Cystic fibrosis is diagnosed just by measuring how salty your sweat is, because people with CF have very, very salty sweat. So all of these scientific insights are the direct result of Dr. Anderson's discovery. Then, fast forward to 1989. You may have heard of Francis Collins. He was the director of the National Institutes of Health for a while, Anthony Fauci's boss. He is a geneticist, and he was leading a team of geneticists at the University of Michigan who were looking for the CF gene because they knew it was a genetic disease. Another geneticist named Lapchi Choi was doing the same thing with his team at Babies Hospital in Toronto. Dr. Lapchi Choi and Dr. Francis Collins ran into each other at a conference, and they made an incredible decision. They decided that even though they were teams of rivals, they were competing for the right to say, we discovered this. They had slightly different methods of searching through the genome, and they decided to combine their efforts and cooperate. And they discovered the cystic fibrosis gene in 1989. It was one of the most remarkable acts of cooperation in the history of science. Those two guys should really be proud of each other.
Wow.
And themselves.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive stuff. I mean, there's so much competition, and a little more cooperation now and then would probably go a long way.
So it took a long time. When they discovered the gene in 1989, everybody was like, well, we'll cure the disease in 5 years now, because now we can do gene therapy. Well, it wasn't that simple. Fast forward to 2019, I mean, and finally the FDA approved a drug called Trikafta, and that meant that as a result of these genetic discoveries, there is a drug available to 90+% of people with CF that actually treats the underlying cause of the disease. It's not gene therapy, but it's sort of cellular therapy. And I happened to be at the North American Cystic Fibrosis Conference a few days after the FDA decision. Dr. Collins was there with his guitar singing 2 songs about cystic fibrosis. 5,000 deliriously happy people, and I was one of them. I got deliriously miserable a few weeks later when I discovered the price that Vertex Pharmaceuticals planned to charge for this drug, $312,000 a year per patient.
Whoa.
So that's why Rose and I are big into laying siege to big pharma.
Huh. And one would think, I mean, this certainly wasn't what they call an orphan.
It actually is considered an orphan disease.
Oh, really?
Even though, yes, 40,000 people with cystic fibrosis, that is considered under federal law an orphan disease. And you know, if you really want to get into the healthcare policy of it, orphan diseases, because of the Orphan Disease Act, have suddenly become a very lucrative field for big pharma. So there's been a lot of medical research and a lot of medical breakthroughs in orphan diseases. There's a lot of money to be made, right, Rose?
Oh yeah, lots of money.
So we think cystic fibrosis drugs and all other high-tech medicine should be reasonably priced. I mean, if you are Vertex Pharmaceuticals and you bring a drug like that to market with lots of help from the CF Foundation, by the way, your investors should make a healthy return, but not an obscene return. And so Rose and I are both hooked up with this awesome nonprofit in Boston called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER. And what ICER does is what the government would do in a better world, which is investigate whether drugs are fairly priced based on their incremental value. And it turns out that they looked at Trikafta and determined that it's overpriced by about a factor of 3.
Uh-huh. So what happens then?
The insurance industry and other people who worry about these things put pressure on the drug company to lower its price. That hasn't happened with Trikafta yet. And Rose can tell you she doesn't take Trikafta. Why? Because her mom and dad bequeathed her with exotic cystic fibrosis mutations that aren't amenable to that class of drugs. So Rose's miracle is in the future, and she's busy helping to make that miracle happen by participating in drug trials.
Uh-huh. So Rose, tell us a little bit about participating in drug trials.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of the exotic mutations with which I was endowed by my lovely parents, I actually did not have a lot of opportunities to participate in drug trials after I gained consciousness when I was like 8. I believe I did some when I was really young and small, but my first actual opportunity to contribute to efforts to actually cure the disease was really last summer, in which I participated in a gene therapy trial. They basically took my specific mutations and made an inhaled solution, so basically a nebulizer, and put a corrected gene in there and had me inhale it for, I think it was like 3 hours. I was admitted. It was a whole day of hospital activities where everybody was gowned, like they didn't want any of that, genetically modified inhaled material on them because they don't know what it would do. And then, so I was dosed, and then they followed me up very closely for the first month. And then they gave me a bronchoscopy, which is a big fancy word that means that they basically flushed out and swabbed my lungs, and took a look at whether or not there was any repaired gene, or whether it took hold in the cells in my lungs. And they did find that even it was 2 months post-dosing, at least, that they found that there was still corrected gene in my lungs. Now, there was never an assumption with the particular trial that I did that this would be a one-time cure, but it was a promising result. And
as I recall, Rose, that they detected a successful transgene implementation, meaning the repaired gene successfully implanted in 40% of the epithelial cells. That 40%, like if they succeed if that sticks, that is a cure, I think.
yeah, I mean, obviously, but they have to figure out how much to dose you with. I was part of the first phase of the trial. I was patient 3, so they had dosed exactly 2 people before they got to me. And really the hope was, this was a phase 1 and 2 trial, so not to bore everybody with the FDA trial protocols, but generally studies are supposed to go through safety and then efficacy, but because the CF population is so small, they kind of have to do 1 and 2 at the same time. So you have to test for both safety, and they're questioning whether it works on the first round of trial participants, which is unusual. And they tentatively got really positive results from my lowest of low doses of the attenuated viral vector corrected gene inhaled solution. So it's looking promising, and they are still following me up with that. I go in for visits and they call me up on the phone to make sure I haven't grown a tail, which I have not yet. And I'm really looking forward to future opportunities to participate in whatever they'll have me. But a niche problem with gene therapy is actually that not in the trial that I participated in, but in many, once you've done one, you can't do more, because
this is why Rose's. Sorry to interrupt, Rose. This is why her nickname, and one of her nicknames, is now Patient 3, because. And I, as somebody who's active in reining in big pharma, I want to call out the name of the company that's developing this drug, 4D Molecular Therapeutics. They're based out in California, because I don't want to trash big pharma. We need companies like 4D Molecular Therapeutics to work on these drugs. And man, I hope that I hope that compound pays off for them, and I hope their shareholders make a lot of money. And because that will deliver the goods for my kid, Patient 3.
Now, Don, does the federal government, and therefore the American taxpayer, help to finance that research?
That's a great question. So it depends on what you mean by finance the research. A lot of the basic science research that drives innovation like that is done at the National Institutes of Health organization that Dr. Collins ran, and our taxpayer dollars finance that. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation raises a ton of money. I mean, I just bragged that I'm trying to raise $650,000. And if I do, I'll get my body covered with rose tattoos. Why is that? Because the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation invests a lot of money in drug research. The CF Foundation invented this thing called venture philanthropy. And, if you want to get it, I'm a lawyer, right? So I love to talk about this. Foundations are allowed to not just donate money, but actually invest in things that advance their mission. So what the CF Foundation did was it invested alongside a firm out in California called Aurora Biosciences in the project that led to the development of these so-called modulator drugs. They invested $150 million in the project, and in 2 tranches in 2014 and 2018, the foundation cashed out its share of the royalties that it was entitled to in exchange for that $150 million investment. Would you care to guess the amount of money that was paid to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation as payback for that $150 million investment? Just give me a guess.
I couldn't even fathom a guess.
Well, I'll just tell you then. The sum is $3.8 billion. $3.8 billion.
Holy cow.
Now, that is a lot of money. And people sometimes say, well, Don, why should I donate to the CF Foundation when it's cashing checks like that? And my answer is, well, because it's going to cost $10 billion to cure the disease. Yeah, they put 3.8 billion in the bank, and they're spending it. It's not like giving money to Princeton. They're not building buildings and stuff like that. They are investing in science. The CF Foundation has its own therapeutics lab in Lexington, Massachusetts, and so they do their own research, and they own the intellectual property rather than paying somebody at some academic institution to do the research. Because when that happens, they own the intellectual property. So the foundation develops that stuff, they own it. And it's great. I'm so happy to be part of this, but it's a Faustian bargain, right? Because the other flip side of that 3.8 billion is the price I named earlier. You know, the list price of Trikafta is now up to, last I checked, $326,000 a year. And, you know, like most CF patients are just perfectly happy with that price because insurance companies are paying it. But, you know, Rose and I think about the implications of that societally, asking our neighbors, other people, my fellow state employees who are on the state health plan to chip in that kind of money in order for somebody to take one drug. It's unsustainable. The thing that keeps me up at night as a CF dad isn't that the science is going to fail my kid or that the medicine is going to fail my kid. I'm worried that civilization is going to falter.
Yeah, and there's just something in the entire formula when it comes to, you know, funding by taxpayers and the fact that they're not included ultimately in reaping the rewards, other than what happens with the effectiveness of the drug.
Yeah,
And
well, there's just Faustian bargains galore in all of this stuff, and you know, when Rose's miracle comes, it's going to be wicked expensive. You know, I'm thinking about that all the time.
yeah, yeah. Wow. So, so you figured out where you're going to put all your tattoos, Don?
I, I haven't yet. Actually, a week from Tuesday, I'm going down to Capital City Tattoo, which is my official tattoo provider, and they are going to tattoo a single rose on my leg. I decided that if I'm really going to do this, you know, if the world is really going to make that geezer get those tattoos, then I should at least have one put on me right off as a sign of good faith. And I think that probably if I really do raise all that money, and if I really do have to get the tattoos, I'll probably put most of them or maybe all of them on my legs. And I think of that as appropriate because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, you know? I'm thinking of people like the sports writer Frank DeFord. He was one of my favorite sports commentators. I used to listen to him on National Public Radio. And for years, I couldn't figure out why he really got it about sports. Like he understood the humanity of it. And then after I became a CF dad, I discovered that he was also a CF dad. He wrote a book about his daughter called Alex, The Life of a Child. She died when she turned 8 years old in 1980. And Frank DeFord became the chairman of the CF Foundation. He wrote a book about his daughter, and he dedicated the rest of his life to curing the disease. He's also a CF hero. I'm sorry I never got to meet him.
So, Rose, what was it like growing up with an obsessive father like this?
Well, I have news for you. And CF parents get a lot more obsessive than my dad. Speaking from the remote experience I have meeting and knowing other CF kids, because we're not allowed to meet in person, because the risk of us exchanging opportunistic bacteria that my dad was talking about earlier is actually too high. So I actually don't know any in person, but the CF parents are a particular breed, and everybody handles a diagnosis like cystic fibrosis differently. And I think I grew up under the sort of mentality of not resenting, but really eschewing any responsibility for being a public facing CF kid, because, you know, there are all these sob stories that are frequently used to raise money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And I just sort of didn't want it to define me in that way when I was that young. And I also think that there's, like Dad was saying earlier, there is a real temptation to sort of, as a parent, curl up into the fetal position and just get real helicoptery. So all things considered, I would say that Dad falls somewhere closer to the normal side of the spectrum. That being said, both my parents were both involved in the Northern New England chapter. Dad specifically is very prone to doing stuff like this. And it's not a problem from my perspective. I think it's funny and wholesome, and generally a really effective way of accomplishing what we all want to accomplish, which is curing cystic fibrosis. But the work ahead of me is more in the vein of, participating in drug trials, putting my head down to wait for the actual cure to happen, sticking around long enough for the actual cure to happen. Whereas the work for parents, for people who love people with CF, is really to do things like tattoo your body with 65 roses for.
But wait a minute, Rose, you left something out. And this goes back to Wayne's earlier question of like, what's the advice for parents? Every CF parent comes to this juncture when their kid is an adolescent. And I remember exactly when it happened with Rose, and what Rose had to say to her dad was, "Back off, Dad." That is literally what she said to me. Because there came a time where I thought that the people who were running her high school were not being sufficiently accommodating. And so I started like working the phones and my email and calling people at the school and kind of yelling at them for not doing what I thought they should be doing with my kid. And Rose just she got really mad at me, and she hauled off and said, "Back off, Dad. You're not the one with the disease. I'm the one with the disease. I'll take it from here." And every single CF parent has that moment. And it is hard to do that.
My admiration for you, Don, grows every time we talk. So, here's the question that you just precipitated, Rose, and that is this: you're not allowed to hang out with other people who have CF, but most of the time, you're not walking around with a little button or something that makes me realize that you have CF, are you?
Yep, yeah, correct. I do not.
Right.
So I think
I mean, you could be running into people who have CF all the time.
exactly. And to be honest, I probably am, although it's never happened in the real world where I've actually discovered if that's what's happening or not. But generally the consensus is it's COVID rules. You're supposed to be 6 feet apart. You don't actually, it's not that you can never really meet them, because at CF events, like Great Strides events, these big walkathons basically to raise money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, multiple people with CF do show up. That's just inevitable at these events.
But they have everybody wearing.
They make us wear Dad is horrible about interrupting. They do make us wear purple shirts at the CF events. So when there is a Cystic Fibrosis Foundation event, that we do actually wear these really, in my opinion, rather obnoxious purple shirts that say "I am a fighter" in big letters on the back, which kind of irks me. But in life in general, you're right. We don't wear pins, we don't wear buttons, we don't wear shirts that are specifically denoted that you have cystic fibrosis. And so that's just life. And there are people whom before genetic testing was available, or widespreadly used, there are people who have siblings with CF and they have CF themselves. And there just are situations where it's understood that living in the world with cystic fibrosis is just an inherent risk. And one of those risks is running into other people with CF. And you just kind of have to, it's another one of those situations that requires reasonableness and not curling up into a fetal position and freaking out about it at every juncture, because you could react to this whole situation in a way that would result in you not having a life and you receding from any sort of normal society. And that's, I think, generally not an appropriate reaction.
Well,
there was this wonderful tearjerker movie a few years ago called 5 Feet Apart, about two teenagers with CF who fall in love in the hospital, but have to stay 6 feet apart. which they lowered to 5 feet apart. And it was quite a sweet movie, and not completely scientifically accurate, but nevertheless kind of really conveyed some of what's cool about CF and difficult.
Well, and here you are in the middle of the college experience, and I frankly can't think of any time in my whole life, even when I was in politics, where I was so regularly exposed to big crowds of people, in close contact with one another.
Yeah. I mean, Bowdoin itself is actually a very small school of approximately 1,800 people. So it's actually, the crowds that I encounter are never huge. That being said, when I applied, and when I was thinking about college generally, I was very open and apparent about my cystic fibrosis. And occasionally, this didn't happen at Bowdoin, but at a few other institutions, they got back to me and said, oh yeah, we have had CF patients here matriculate. Or alternatively, a few of them were like, yes, we currently have students with cystic fibrosis. And at a small school, actually having another cystic fibrosis person there was a little bit of a deterrent, because it makes it sort of complicated to navigate spaces like cafeterias, like dorms, like classrooms. And this isn't to say that I hope I act as a deterrent to anybody at Bowdoin, but I was very forthcoming, and I hope that they tell other CF people that I am there for both of our benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, what you want to have happen in that scenario, like if another CF student matriculated at Bowdoin, you would say to the health center, could you ask the other CF person if she or he is willing to identify themselves to Rose, and the two of them can just basically work out with each other how they're not going to run into each other. I mean, it comes down to that.
But how does one is there some regulatory reason why a person who had CF would identify themselves to the
No.
Nope.
If that's all HIPAA. If you feel like you don't want to talk about your CF, there's absolutely no impetus for another student to tell me or to tell the institution that they have the disease. Of course, I think that there would be some self-preservation instinct to do otherwise, though. So it all depends. But there could be another person on Bowdoin's campus. I do not know for certain.
Rose, explain HIPAA, please. I mean, you don't have to go
the actual the HIPAA. So it's the I don't know the acronym names, but it's the law that entitles a patient to confidentiality and privacy. Right. So I, as a CF patient, I do not give my clinicians or any of my healthcare providers the permission to go about telling the world that, oh, Rose Keller has cystic fibrosis, because medical conditions can be really sensitive subjects. And of course, CF is, a pulmonary disease, and there's no real moral character to it. But I mean, I think it's really easy to imagine a whole host of reasons and a whole host of circumstances in which you wouldn't want to be open about your medical history or your medical conditions, because they can be embarrassing, because they can make other people uncomfortable, they can make you uncomfortable. It's your personal information and you are entitled to it. So I'm pro HIPAA going out right in front of me.
HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was adopted in 1994, but everybody just knows the acronym, and you are entitled to privacy in your medical records. That's for sure.
So a Bowdoin College student, if they have CF, doesn't have to say anything to the effect of, I have CF, other than they would be incentivized to know if other people had it. Because again, you don't want to, I don't want someone giving me some horribly antibiotic resistant bacteria in Thorne Dining Hall. That's just not what I want to be doing. And that's not what they want to be doing. So my hope that there's sort of a mutual instinct that precludes that from happening.
Well, we should do like a whole nother hour about like superbugs and the fact that we're running out of antibiotics and need to do something about that. That's a whole other subject.
Yeah.
Huh. So yeah. So the research that's being done into antibiotics is not yielding sufficient quantities or qualities of the antibiotics?
The drug companies aren't developing new antibiotics because they can't make money at it. Like Trikafta, the drug that costs 300 grand a year, like you're basically going to take that forever, right? But if you take antibiotics, you're supposed to only take them as long as you need them, which means they're not a lifetime thing. And so it's hard for drug companies to make money off of them. And there's a proposal in Congress called the Pasteur Act, named after Louis Pasteur, that is supposed to address that, but it never seems to pass. That's another whole hour we could do.
Does that somehow provide incentives for the drug companies to
Yes,
do the development?
yes. It's a subscription model. It would basically mean that the federal government would subscribe to a particular antibiotic, a new antibiotic, and they would pay the drug company basically regardless of how much of the drug actually gets sold. So it's something us utility geeks would call revenue decoupling.
Yeah, you're right. That's an entirely different show, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But complex.
Oh yeah. Well, it's such a cool subject. Cystic fibrosis just touches everything. Genetics, biology, chemistry, healthcare policy. You name it. It's just endlessly fast. The history of it is fascinating. Huh. Yeah.
So here's the question about how can people get involved in your 65 Roses campaign? How can they donate? How can they help?
We have a web page. It's sort of a subpage of the CF Foundation website, and it's best looked at in writing, but I can just rattle it off right here. It's just give.cff.org/celebration/tattoos for Don, all one word, with the number 4 in the middle.
Okay, I'll make sure to put that in the show notes so we actually have it.
Yeah.
Right. And I am a person of modest means, but I just had a photo, one of my photographs chosen for an international masters magazine or book. And I'm going to donate. There are 9 signed prints still available of the thing. I'm trying to see if I can show it to you. This can you see that?
Oh wow.
I can. Yeah, this being a podcast, the
Right.
millions of people listening can't see it.
Well,
we're
we're gonna put this on YouTube as well.
Ah.
So people will be able to see it. It doesn't, but that's not the important part. I just happen to have a couple of interesting images that relate to Rose's name. So what we're going to do is I'll use what I would have been able to afford to donate to do the printing and the mailing, and if we can convince some people to buy originals, then all of that will go to your fund, Don.
That's so cool. And really, the publicity is invaluable, because in order to get to the heights that I'm hoping to get to, in order to make that geezer get those tattoos, we have to raise a lot of money, which means it has to go viral. And I am starting to get donations from people I don't know. So I'm really happy.
Well, I sort of wondered why, if the reason that you jumped aboard with Rose's suggestion to increase it to 650,000 was because you thought it was going to be impossible to raise that kind of money and you'd never have to get the tattoos.
Well, okay. Well, let me just say 2 things. One, I conceived of it as a win-win proposition, because you're right. I'm not lusting to get my body covered with tattoos, but it's a win-win, because if I do raise that much money, I'll be famous, and sure, I'll do it. Why not? But if I don't hit the benchmark and I don't get covered in tattoos, that'll be just fine too. And there's a great case called Leonard versus PepsiCo that you should look up. It's all about Pepsi offering to give away Pepsi merchandise in exchange for Pepsi points, and they ran this cheeky ad that showed a kid pulling up to his high school in a Harrier jet, and the caption was something like, "Harrier jets, 7 million Pepsi points." So this guy John Leonard, shows up, writes Pepsi a letter, and says, "I've got 7 million Pepsi points. Where's my jet?" And Pepsi said, "We're not giving you a jet. Get lost." And the case ended up in the federal district court in the Southern District of Manhattan, decided by Judge Kimba Wood. Do you know what she said? She said, "Get lost." That is not my scenario. I intend to bind myself to this promise.
Ah, oh, jeez. I'm Judge Kimba Wood. Wow.
Remember her? She was nominated to be Attorney General by President Clinton. Remember what tripped up her nomination?
Right. It was it a nanny or something like
Yes, that's right. Wayne, you have a good memory. That's right. She got in trouble for basically having a nanny who wasn't on payroll, and so she wasn't paying the right taxes in order to have a employee in her household.
When we look back at that, we just kind of shrug our shoulders given everything that we've gone through with other nominees.
Right. I think Judge Wood should donate to my 65 Roses campaign and make that geezer get those tattoos. And if she does, I will make her honorary chairwoman of the campaign.
Uh-oh. Don, I have to warn you that I'm trying to arrange a podcast with her husband. So she may find out about this.
Well, tell her to call me up. I'd be happy to chat about it with her.
All right. Well, Don, Kreis, and Rose, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And I wish you well. And Don, I can't wait to see, I can't wait to see your exercise regime after you have the 65 roses tattooed on you, so that you'll be looking like RFK Jr. or something.
I'm gonna look so good in the hearing room of the Public Utilities Commission in my day job as consumer advocate. Really looking forward to
that. Well, thank you very much. And I hope to talk to you both soon.
Thank you.
Take care. My thanks to Don Kreis and Rose Keller for joining us on this episode of The Radical Centrist to talk about the 65 Roses campaign against cystic fibrosis. Now, the show notes for this podcast can be found at theradicalcentrist.us, where you can make a contribution, where you can leave a review, and where you can join the 65 Roses campaign. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to do that. On the show notes page, you will be able to link directly to Don's campaign site to make a donation. You'll also be able to link to my art gallery website to purchase one of several award-winning photographs that feature a rose in some fashion, including the rose and the headdress, which is a celebration of my Native American heritage, along with Rose. And you'll also be able to go to Anamaki, ANAMAKI.com, which is the website for our podcasting company, and make your contribution there.
Thanks also once again to our good friend Free Joseph, whose website is freejoseph.net, where you can purchase any of the songs. Thanks very much for joining us on this episode of The Radical Centrist. And we'll see you again very soon. So now take us out, Free.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. We always feel that there is something